lovely to spend this time with you today, and I want to talk to you about a program of work around integrating mindfulness into the sphere of depression and public health and more broadly. I'm going to be covering a lot of ground and a lot of work, and I kind of calculated that every minute of my presentation is about a year's worth of work. So please don't feel like you have to make notes or memorize everything, because the slides have all got links to papers or reports or anything else. And I just made the slide available on the Manchester Festival's LinkedIn page, so you can download the slides, and then from that you can click through to all the papers and resources. So I'm going to be painting with a very broad, I'm going to be painting a very broad tapestry with lots of brush strokes, and every one of those strokes is, as I say, quite a lot of detail. I'm happy to answer questions about any of that detail as I go through. So this is a photograph that's about 50 years old, and that is in Lagos in Nigeria, and that little boy sitting on the car is me. And that is my grandfather and my grandmother, and that is Hillary and his wife, who lived with us and looked after us. And I'm putting that slide up because I'm inviting you to think about how much has happened in the last 50 years. And I'm going to focus, I could focus on so many things. I could focus on what's happened in Nigeria, I could focus on diversity, but just for the sake of just a coherent story, I'm going to focus on obesity and heart health. That's my grandfather. He died not soon after that of a heart attack. He ate a lot of meat, he exercised, he didn't exercise, he smoked. I don't eat a lot of meat. I exercise and I gave up smoking in my 20s. I used to travel in that car on the back. And both my parents would smoke with the windows up. Imagine if that car had hit something in the Lagos traffic, which, by the way, was not an impossible possibility. I would have, like a projectile, gone through the smoke and the front window into the Lagos streets. Nobody would dream of putting their kid on the back thing of a car now, and passive smoking is pretty unlikely. And I just met the wonderful Lucas, who is 9 months young. The kind of life he's going to lead is, I'd like to suggest to you, going to be very different to the one I led, which is very different to the one my grandfather led. And in what way? So what I want to do in the next 30, 40 minutes is take you on a journey which starts with depression and how we've responded to depression. And I want to cast this as a success story, that this is something, a partial success story, where we've learned a lot, we've implemented a lot, we've made a big, big difference and a big, big change. But we have a whole set of really quite profound challenges that Lucas, by the way, if you're wondering who Lucas is the daughter of, the grandson of Liz Lord and the son of Annie Lord. And I am full of wonderful feelings right now because I just spent 5 minutes with him. I'm just very sad he's not here at my talk. That's there. The challenges that we face that Lucas's generation is going to live through. So let's start with depression. And I'll do this quite quickly because I think I'm going to guess most of you are familiar with this, and I think the interesting parts of the talk are the latter parts of the talk, and I want to focus there and I want to talk with you all. World population's just pushed over 7 billion. About 250 to 300 million people in the world today will be suffering from clinically significant levels of depression. About 1 billion people alive in the world today will suffer from depression at some point in their lifetime. Now, we can get into a mindfulness bubble, but there's another bubble we could get into, which is the idea that there is more progress than there has been. In developed countries, as few as 1 in 5 will get appropriate levels of care for their common mental health problems. In low and middle income countries, that's 1 in 27. So countries like India and China, where the majority of the world's population live, 1 in 27 of those people who are prone to depression will receive the kind of treatments that we know work. So we have a long way to go to get to address this problem of depression. The other thing I want to say in terms of just articulating the problem is that we know, one of the things we know now that we didn't know when that photograph was taken was that the majority of mental health problems will first arise in late adolescence and early adulthood. And when they do, they tend to have a life course a little bit like this. There isn't this idea of it's like a flu or a cold, that you have a mental health problem, you get treatment, you get better. Very often people will have an episode, they'll get better, but they'll have some residual symptoms, and then they'll get another episode, and then they'll get residual symptoms again. Another. It's kind of like a chronic, ongoing part of life. And certainly depression looks like that. So if we are going to be serious about depression, we need to bear these things in mind. How can we respond? Well, the story of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is, I think, a nice story in part because the problem was formulated well by Mark Williams, Zindel Siegel, and John Teasdale. They said, okay, we've got things that we know that work for depression, antidepressants, cognitive behavioral therapy, physical exercise, lots of these kinds of things. But what about the people who are in this pattern of relapsing depression? Can we help those people step out of a pattern of getting depressed again and again and again? A really simple premise, a really important premise. Can we change the trajectory of their lives so that they can actually learn the skills to stay well in the long term? So they developed this intervention, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression. And again, I'm going to do this all very quickly because most of you will be very familiar with this. And it was a really cleverly composed program that drew on the very best of cognitive behavioral therapy, the very best of mindfulness-based stress reduction, and a clear theoretical rationale, which I'll come back to in a minute. And they then set out to answer this really important question. Does it work? Is it effective? We have to know whether what we're offering is effective. And the short answer is yes. That yes probably conveys 20 years of work in that one phrase. So these are meta-analyses of individual data from up to 16 different randomized controlled trials. And I'm going to summarize 3 key findings from this. The first is that this approach, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for recurrent depression, is more effective than usual care without any shadow of doubt. The margins of error suggest with that. And that has led to it being introduced in clinical guidelines in many countries around the world. The second thing I want to say is that the evidence, I think, fairly clearly shows that, I'm going to say definitively shows that it is an alternative to maintenance antidepressants. Hundreds of millions of people around the world are currently, including myself, are currently taking a maintenance dose of antidepressants to stay well. What we've done is we've shown that there is a possibility for people, if they want to come off their antidepressants and use the skills they've learned in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. I think that's a tremendous success story. The third thing we've learned, and this feeds into the panacea story, is that it seems to be more effective for people with more severity, more adversity, more of a history of abuse. The counter to that is if somebody's got a history of depression and they're not that unwell, they probably don't need to invest in an 8-week mindfulness-based program. The evidence suggests that psychoeducation, physical exercise, good self-care is probably plenty. And that's important. We need to think about when and when it isn't appropriate. And Becca spoke to this last point just now, and this is really important, and this is why I said partial success story. We've done a lot of work asking the question. This is the work that Becca and I did together, which she was referring to. We've done a lot of work to ask okay, so we've developed this intervention, and we've asked if it works. It does. Is it actually accessible to people in healthcare services around the world? The brutally honest answer to that is no. No, it is not. Even in this country, by this country I mean England, where it is mandated by NICE, we have trained hundreds of therapists, including in the NHS. It's countercultural. It requires group approaches. IAP services are concerned with trying to get people well. We have done so much good work, but yet we have a long way to cross that gap of implementation to make this accessible to people. Even though we've shown that when it's offered in the NHS, the outcomes are comparable to what they are in trials. And Zindel Siegel has also started to look at offering this digitally. Just before I close this particular part of the story, I want to talk about mechanisms. What I mean by that is asking and answering the question, how does MBCT work? What is happening for people when they go through an MBCT program? And the reason I think MBCT for depression is a success story is because Mark, Zindel, and John so clearly articulated an account of what is changing for people with recurrent depression, what needs to change, rather. And it's this way in which somebody prone to depression can have just a fragment of low mood. Just a little thought like, somebody at the back there looks like they're bored by my talk. I must be a hopeless human being. Boom, 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 boom. All of us have negative thoughts. All of us feel a bit sad. But for someone with depression, this reactivity is so powerful. And what the program does is, to use this analogy of the black dog from Matthew Johnston's beautiful cartoon, helps people change their relationship to that black dog. It's still there. They still have the sad thoughts. They still have that power, potentially, but they don't allow themselves to get carried away by them. And we've demonstrated in a number of studies, including really smart studies by some of these folks who've worked in my group and Mai van der Velden recently, that this is actually on self-report measures, on biobehavioral measures, but actually also on neuroscience indicators, getting people in the scanner before and afterwards and seeing if we can get them ruminating in that way. And people are able to disengage from that reactivity. Now, that's important because that means the more we as teachers can focus on what we know is important for people, the more we can really create change. But this is, I think, a potential game changer in the whole kind of depression area. Historically, depression treatments, antidepressants or CBT have said, this person's severely depressed or moderately depressed. Let's get them so they're not depressed anymore. But there's also, I'm living with a sense of purpose. I'm living with a sense of joy. I'm living with a sense of feeling completely revitalized by 2 minutes with Lucas. What the evidence from CBT is showing, and 2 studies now from MBCT, is that if we are able to do this work as well with depression, we get better outcomes. It isn't just about getting to somebody to non-depressed, it's about helping them reconnect with their sense of purpose, their sense of connection, their sense of being valued and enjoyment in the world. Now that might seem a bit abstract to you. So what I've tried to do is to take some of the work we've been doing with MBCT. What does that look like to activate the positive valence system, if you like? What are we actually doing? So what I've put on one side of this graph, and thanks to Liz, because she suggested this to me while I was traveling up on the train yesterday. These are the kinds of things that might be in the program. And on the right is what we're activating, what we're helping change for people, the mechanisms. So we're asking people to complete a positive events calendar. We're asking people to do appreciative practices. We're asking, and by appreciation, I mean the sort of plurality of appreciation, a sense of savoring, a sense of joy, a sense of contentment. we're asking people to look at what's nourishing them in their lives. I had breakfast with Becca this morning, and we were talking about how often we neglect this organism of my body, my mind, my diet, my exercise. What does it take to nourish this organism so that I can actually be effective in the world? And by doing this is Jeffrey Rose's argument, which is one I'm going to develop in the rest of my talk, which is with heart health, my grandfather, it's not a good idea to wait for him to have a heart attack and then do the best you can to keep him alive. It didn't work for him. Actually, in his days, they used to put those people in a ward away from the nurses' station so everything was quiet, and then they realized that that was too late to get to them if they had another event and they would die. That's 50 years of progress, right? What we need to do, Jeffrey Rose argues, is work with the whole population and shift the whole population towards greater health. And this is what I think we need to do with depression as well. How can we work with the underlying mechanisms that feed depression and do some prevention? I just want to very briefly describe a bit of work I'm doing with Rick Hecht, Zindel Siegel and others, which is about taking people who've been through an 8-week MBCT for depression program and are still at risk. And there's a curriculum we've developed called the Taking It Further curriculum that does, in part, exactly what I've just described. Begin to activate that sense of purpose, that sense of meaning, that sense of appreciative joy. And actually, I was just watching a video of yesterday of one of those sessions, and it is extraordinary. It actually made the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I heard the people describing how they were applying this in their lives, not just to stay well, but to make changes in their lives. Okay. I'm guessing you probably know much of what I've already said, and I want to go on to some of the newer stuff. If we're going to be serious about depression, and if we accept that the age of onset is in late adolescence and early adulthood, we need to think about how we can help young people and children. Kind of a no-brainer, right? And if you add into the mix that we are seeing rates of mental health problems in young people between 1 in 5, maybe 1 in 4, possibly even 1 in 3 significant mental health problems in mid to late adolescence, that's quite alarming. So that makes a very compelling case for thinking about teaching young people at that stage of life the skills to stay well, resilience skills, if you like. So I've spent the last 8-9 years working on a project where we explored whether or not teaching children mindfulness could help them develop those skills. Where did we do it? We did it in schools. We thought to ourselves, this is where the majority of, where children of this age group spend the majority of their lives. And actually, there was a lot of impetus, a lot of pressure to think about schools as being a vehicle for the promotion of mental health. A group of young people helped us title this, the My Resilience in Adolescent Project, the Myriad Project. And it set out to answer this question. Can school-based mindfulness training teach young people resilience in a way that can improve their mental health and well-being in that crucial period before mental health problems first arise? It was a monumental effort. So it took a small village. This is the small village. Over 8 years, we recruited 28,000 children, more than 100 schools, more than 650 teachers. One way or another, we worked with about 100 researchers. We have 20 million data points. Extraordinary amount of data. And we've published to date about 20 peer-reviewed science papers. Before we started, what did we already know? We knew that we had a real challenge with mental health in young people. And there was a lot of work suggesting that mindfulness in schools would be a good way to teach children these skills. Lots of small studies, perhaps not controlled, of unknown quality. We pulled those all together into a systematic review and meta-analysis, and they were promising. What did we do? We asked, is this scalable and implementable? Is it effective? And does it work in the way we think it works, by teaching young people these skills of attention and self-regulation? We were incredibly lucky. The project was led by Mark Williams, Sarah Jane Blakemore, Tim Dalglish, and myself. And we had amazing people working on this project. But one of the people who was amazing was the chair of our trial steering committee. And because it took us 4 years to collect the data, he suggested, look, you don't know what you're going to find. Why don't you spend a bit of time coming up with a kind of model so that whatever you find, you can interpret it. So we looked at the literature, and that's what we did. And I'm not going to go into the details of this. Like I said, I'm painting with a broad brush. But what I want to point you to is when we think about mindfulness, we think about an intervention focused at a group of people. So that's the middle of this diagram, the mindfulness intervention focused on the children in the school. But that sits within a meso level of the school itself, the culture and the climate of the school. And that sits within a broader context of the community within which that school exists. And within that, you have to think about, do issues of ethnicity and race act as moderators for these effects? Are these kids enjoying this program, engaging with this program? Are the teachers able to teach this program? These are all questions that if you don't answer them, you'll never know how to interpret your findings. So that's the reason for having the model. What did we find? Well, the first thing that we found was really interesting, which was because we had so many schools, we could ask this question: how much does the school actually have to do with the young people's mental health? What I mean by that is how much of the variance in young people's mental health is actually down to the school? It's tiny. It's between about 1% and 4% in our study, and in other studies up to 8%. So when you see a policymaker or somebody say, the schools are going to put our mental health crisis to rights, no, they're not. They're going to have a role, but it's going to be a small role. A lot of head teachers went, oh, thank you. The other thing we learned, which was really interesting, this is before I get into the trial, was, oh my goodness, we do have a real problem. When you see this and you stop and think about this, and this is just on the measure of depression, about 1 in 3, this is a representative sample of 28,000 children in this country, and Wales, and Scotland, and Northern Ireland. 1 in 3 are telling us that they are in quite a lot of distress. I don't know about you, but I don't think that's acceptable at any level. As a parent, as a citizen, as an adult, responsible. I don't want Lucas to walk into that world where he walks into a classroom of 30 children and 10 of those children are going to experience significant mental health challenges. That's not acceptable in my view. So we have a real issue. We have a real challenge. So the main part of the study, we had lots of parts of the study, but the main part of the study was a cluster randomized controlled trial. What that means is that we took 85 schools and we randomized schools, whole schools, either to the mindfulness intervention or, because of the way we did the study, the schools carried on offering decent social emotional teaching. So we didn't have any schools where we thought this is a school that is just a desert for social emotional education. So all of our schools had some decent social emotional education. In the mindfulness schools, we spent a lot of time trying to offer the teachers their own mindfulness training. They did an 8-week course. We made sure they did the 8-week course. We tried to support them in developing a practice. We did a 4-day training to teach them how to teach the curriculum. And then we had 2 mentors, Liz and Jem Shackelford, mentor them as they started to teach mindfulness to the children in their school. They ran, I think, 1 or 2 trial classes, and then they started teaching the mindfulness in schools. And we followed up the kids. We wanted to know if it improved their mental health and well-being, but we also looked at the teachers and we looked at the school climate. Our primary outcome was 1 year after they were randomized, so about 9 months after they'd done the mindfulness course. And what we found, without any shadow of doubt, because this was adequately powered, it was a representative sample of children, and we had very little dropout. The study was done extremely well. We had a fantastic team, that there was no impact on the young people's mental health and well-being. Now, obviously, that's disappointing at some level, right? Because it makes you think, hang on, the case was really good, the systematic review, we did 2 pilot studies, they'd all been promising, but there was absolutely no signal whatsoever. We had some secondary outcomes for the children as well, to do with self-efficacy, anxiety, and so on. And actually, there was a slight signal that the kids in the mindfulness arm did a little bit worse. And then we asked the question, what works for whom? And we tried to look at subgroups of children to see which children did well and which didn't. Older children did a little bit better than the younger children. Children with more mental health challenges did a little bit worse than children with less mental health challenges. This is all really important and interesting stuff. I'll come back to this in a bit. We also looked at the teachers. And consistent with all the previous studies, we did find that the teachers benefited from the intervention. And this is, anybody working in education, this is non-trivial, right? Because rates of burnout, the challenge of being a teacher in a secondary school is really high. The teachers benefited from the mindfulness intervention. And really interestingly, and hang on to this thought because I'm going to develop this, the children and the teachers reported improvements in the culture and the climate of the school. So everything I say now is post hoc, i.e. we planned these analyses, but there were no hypotheses about it. We asked the children whether they practiced the mindfulness skills, whether they went home and they did all of the practices. And we made sure that they had them accessible. Headspace even gave them all free prescriptions. Liz was emailing all the teachers saying, send reminders, send reminders, send reminders. The kids didn't practice. They just didn't practice. Teacher said to me, Willem, what did you expect? They're kids, you're giving them homework. Why do you think they were going to do it? And if you look at the graph on your right, that is their view of the curriculum and of the teaching. On the left hand is they really weren't into it, and on the right hand, they were really into it. So you've got a really mixed view. So if you go back to this model, we've got some issues in the middle of the model. Okay, we've got the kids. So if you look at this model, if you want an intervention to work, people need to engage with it. If they don't engage with it, you can't expect the outcome to happen. They didn't engage with it. We put so much effort into training those teachers. It was hard. It was like Sisyphus, wasn't it, Liz? Like pushing, it's really hard. These poor teachers, they have so much on their plate. If you move out to the wider circle, this study actually was published today. If you look at which factors in schools are predicting mental health, over the 2 years of the study, I'm just leaving mindfulness to one side for one moment, the school culture and the school climate is one of the only and most powerful predictors of mental health over a 2-year period. We have everything in there. We have mindfulness, we have self-efficacy, we have lots of different variables. But whether children feel this is a school where they feel safe, where there's a sense of trust, whether the teachers are people I can go and talk to, whether levels of bullying are at a low level or are well managed, this is a predictor of young people's mental health. Isn't that interesting? So I just wrote this paper for the Times Educational Supplement. I had really good input from some people in the field. And I was sort of trying to make this sort of challenging argument that if climate is important in schools, what does a flourishing school look like? And so I tried to set out what I thought from the evidence and from talking to teachers a flourishing school looks like. And then I looked a bit more broadly at the literature because I really want these findings to be constructive and to help us to make a positive difference. There is actually a huge literature on social emotional learning in education. But when you look at the bits that are successful, they're the ones where there is a sense of this is a long haul. If you're going to do this, this is something that's going to take 5, 10, 20 years to get a school to turn around. And it's going to be complex, and you're going to have to work at these macro, these meso, and these micro levels. And one of the things I find interesting about these programs where the evidence base is strongest is they're looking for people to learn social emotional learning skills. And the expression is caught, not taught. If I'm in a classroom where there's a sense of presence and awareness, sense of kindness, day in, day out, that's what I'm learning. If I'm in a classroom where I feel unsafe, threatened, and people are saying, if you don't get these GCSEs or blah, 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 or you don't get into this football academy, you're a failure as a human being, and here's some mindfulness skills, it's not a joke. That's the reality. That's the reality. That's what a flourishing school looks like. We had I want to make sure, because I've got to be very careful that you don't feel like I'm going into just opinion, because of course part of this is opinion, but I'm trying to make sure everything I say is evidence-based. Within the study, we had an incredible opportunity to look at the COVID pandemic, because a set of our schools finished the study before the pandemic, and then we had a whole raft of schools who came through in the middle of the pandemic. So it was a natural experiment in which we could say, what was the effect of the pandemic on mental health? And what helped young people to cope with the pandemic? So without a shadow of doubt, what you can see on these graphs, so on the right-hand side is the pandemic cohort, left-hand side is the non-pandemic cohort. The pandemic was not great as a population for young people's mental health. They had worse mental health in the pandemic. What were the 3 variables that predicted their mental health? We let mindfulness go altogether because the study hadn't shown an effect. It was, in this order, no, actually, I'm not going to say that because I can't remember. These are the 3 most important variables. The school culture. So kids were going back and forth between the school, right, because of the lockdowns. The quality of the school culture. The quality of the home culture. Was home a place where people felt safe, where there was a sense of fun, where there was someone they could talk to? The quality of their friendships. These are teenagers. Their peers are the most important thing to them, right? Peers, home, school. These 3 variables predicted how well kids did. And then, of course, in the middle of the pandemic, this man, somewhere here, it's probably within 5 miles of me, isn't that amazing? Marcus Rashford held the government to account. One man, 20, how old was he at the time? 23, 24? So the kids are at home, you're going to save some money by not giving them free school meals. They get free school meals because their families are so deprived, they don't have enough money for food. How is that a logical argument? The government said, well, he's just a footballer. Who's going to listen to him? But everybody did. So they introduced free school meals. So why am I putting this up? Because I've talked about the micro level, I've talked about the meso level. At the macro level, we have real problems. I've traveled a lot the last couple of years with deprivation and growing inequality in this country. There is no doubt that deprivation, inequality, and poverty drive mental health. If we're going to do something about the mental health of young people, we need to do something, as Marcus Rashford does, about getting food into their bellies. And as you were saying, about making sure that they're not exposed to things like knife crime. They might be exposed to gangs, because gangs give them a sense of belonging, but let's make sure that they are at least safe and they've got food in their belly, as Marcus Rashford and Raheem Sterling have argued. So the last 50 years, if you go back to that picture of me on the car boot in Lagos, we have made enormous progress. Enormous progress. At the micro level and the meso level. But I just want to put that little shot up of, somebody said to me the other day, there's all these arguments about mindfulness and social change. I sometimes feel like what we're doing is giving people little plastic swords and saying, fight Goliath. The tobacco industry and vaping, I mean, that is huge. It's huge. And we need to probably be honest that rather than just giving people little swords, we need the people in power also, people like Chris Rowan, who used to work in Parliament, is to hold the tobacco industry to account, to hold the social media companies to account, so social media becomes a force for good rather than a force for harm. Without that, these plastic swords will only take us so far. Sorry if I'm being quite challenging. We are, I think, some people of my age are thinking about retirement. How many more years can I wind down? I feel pumped because I think the world that Lucas is inheriting is facing something of a perfect storm. And this is an argument that's framed in a number of different ways. Climate change, loss of biodiversity, technological revolution, AI, all of these things are coming together in a way that are creating a perfect storm. And Albert Einstein, when he was asked about nuclear proliferation and the creation of the atomic bomb after the Second World War, about what would be a response to this, he said the kind of thinking that got us into this problem isn't the kind of thinking that's going to get us out of it. And a lot of people are grasping that nettle and being brave enough to try to frame the problem in a different way. WHO is doing really good work thinking about mental health and global health. 1 in 27, remember, receive adequate care. The Lancet Commission, similar. And there are groups beginning to think about how mental health and climate change, particularly in young people, how those relationships might work. What is that? Again, okay. So, I have 5 minutes. So, together with Eleanor Singh, we're leading a program of work in which we are beginning to think about what that looks like in terms of outcomes. And the way I think that looks in terms of outcomes is we need to think about flourishing, and we're just writing a paper in which we are defining flourishing in the following way. Eco-flourishing. It is impossible for flourishing to exist outside of communities, outside of ecosystems. Outcomes are incredibly entangled at the individual, the collective, and the ecosystem level. This is not abstract. When the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson School, struggling in North London, was taken over by one of these superheads, she realized the kids from really diverse backgrounds didn't like coming there, didn't feel safe there, didn't feel any sense of identification with the school. First thing she did, she worked with the kids. What would it take for you to feel like you wanted to come to this school, you belonged here, you had a sense of pride in this school? Worked with a fashion designer. They developed a new school uniform where the girls who wore a hijab, the people from different ethnic backgrounds, could all choose within the same palette of a school uniform, a uniform that they felt was cool, but also recognized their individuality within an identity of a school. over the next few years, she developed a school that Michelle Obama came to as an exemplar of a school where women, young women, had a sense of pride in themselves, a sense of possibility, a culture that could create change. The city-state of Singapore has legislated that no person can be more than a certain distance away from really substantial green space. This is a city-state. So in this building, there are buildings like this, there would be a rainforest on the 4th floor. There would be a full garden on the top floor. So at lunchtime, we could go for a walk around the rainforest. The outside of the building will be like a whole garden. Green space integrated with living. So this is not an abstract thought. This idea of eco-flourishing is a real thought. What has any of this got to do with mindfulness? Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnam, Vietnamese monk, Vietnamese boat people. This is a Vietnamese quote. In the midst of a storm, remember my idea of a perfect storm, it only takes 1 or 2 people to keep their head, to stay calm, for that group of people, that group of boat people, to make it to shore. He developed this idea of cultivating peace in our minds, cultivating wisdom in our minds, will create the possibility for us to not just eco-flourish, but actually build families where our children feel safe, feel schools where people come to those schools and feel like this is a place where they want to come, they want to play, they want to meet their friends, and they want to learn. If they want to get 12 A stars at GCSE, they can do that too. But that's a safe place that people can come through this practice at the meso and the macro level. I'm trying to think about all those other slides I skipped over. They're actually about the evidencing what I've said in terms of some of the curricula that we're developing, shifting people towards well-being outcomes across things. But I've mistimed my timings. I'm going to give the final word, and hopefully this is going to work, to a group of young people. This is a 45-minute clip. This is a group of young people who, when the myriad findings, when we'd written the first few papers, we invited them to come and talk to us. Liz, you were there for the day, weren't you? And just, I'm just going to say one bit of context. There were 4 different schools, very different backgrounds. Please listen to the first boy with this in mind. He came from an area of East London. He'd, I think, never left East London before. And so what he says at the beginning is, please take it in that context. Hopefully this will work.
In the future, I would like to be rich. I want to have enough money to not worry about anything that may happen.
I want to be someone who's inspirational.
Well, in the future, the main thing I really want for myself is the career that I've always wanted, which is to be a pilot or to be in the RAF, since it's something I really want to do.
I would like my life to look like colourful. I'd like to live in the moment, just to be able to enjoy life the way I'd want it to be.
So I'm sorry that the last part of my whole talk got a little bit lost.